there's probably better places to get your thoughts out. But in terms of just having something where if someone's going to look you up, they're going to be able to find an impressive profile, I think you could do that. You could do all of that without even posting anything, to be honest, and still reach out to people and still, like, they're not going to necessarily read through your posts if they go to your profile. So probably more going to look at experience, bio.
Okay, great. I want to do that. I don't want to post.
Yeah. You don't need to post.
Okay, cool.
Hi everybody, I'm Brune Smith, an international storytelling producer and 3-time indie podcaster newly looking for work in podcast production. This is Podcasting Job, an 8-episode series where I take you behind the scenes of my job search in real time. Welcome to episode 7. Okay, so remember in the trailer I told you I wasn't on LinkedIn, because I wasn't. And I was going to do my networking old school, by phone and email, and I did. That's because I left LinkedIn years ago. It always made me feel like I couldn't figure out the rules of the schoolyard. Not only that, but last year, I permanently deleted all my social media accounts and I moved over to Substack. You can subscribe for free in the show notes. Thanks to the fact that I'm no longer on socials, I can hear myself think again. My attention span is much longer, I've regained creative brain space, a sense of agency, quality time, deeper friendships, peace of mind, and a much better sense of self. So, how come you just heard someone give me advice on LinkedIn? Well, that person you heard at the beginning, that's my friend Mitch Butler. He's a Canadian developer and startup founder, nothing to do with podcasting, but since the beginning of this series, he and my other friend, his co-founder and wife, Julia Mermelstein, who also happens to be a designer and music composer, they've been keeping me accountable behind the scenes. When I decided to start this series and job quest, I knew I was going to need support if I wanted to see it through. So when I told you in episode 1 to surround yourself with people who see you and who understand your vision, I was walking the walk. Mitch and Julia are 2 of the most knowledgeable, creative, and kind people I have ever met. 3 years ago, they were looking for a French conversation tutor online, and that's how we met. Every week since, we've been vibing in French about work projects, creativity, and the occasional Mercury retrograde. For the duration of this series you're listening to, we're also meeting once a week in English so they can help me with the job search and give me feedback and ideas on the podcast series. In this episode, you're going to hear snippets of our conversations, and I'm going to share 3 things with you. 1, a piece of advice they gave me when it comes to creating new relationships in a creative industry. 2, how I came to terms with wanting to try LinkedIn again. And 3, the benefits, drawbacks, and the decision I've made moving forward when it comes to the platform. During one of our conversations, Mitch and Julia had given me a bunch of networking ideas, and I told them I wasn't sure which one to prioritize. Here's what they said, which I think will be helpful for other indie podcasters wanting to go pro.
If I were you and I was choosing from those paths, I would say just getting to know more producers who are pitching ideas and putting together teams, because I think it helps you even in the traditional way of searching. But I think it also could be an interesting avenue if there's just sometimes some little light goes off that they're working on something that you feel like you really could add to. And even just talking about it could get them excited about bringing you onto it as well.
And even just having your name fresh in their minds.
This is Julia.
When they're starting to put together teams, like that's always a plus of just having all of those little connects across not just one network, but maybe several. Because I know like in the in the film industry and like working with film composers and sound designers, it's that exact same process. Like a lot of people, the way that they actually get their in is actually co-composing with an established composer on like a film score. And then they get their in with working with the producer, working with a director, and then their name is on a list that they just start circulating to different people.
Yeah.
So I could imagine it's kind of that, like once your name starts being known to different people, they're going to keep you on the radar.
Mm-hmm. So that's probably where LinkedIn comes in.
Totally. Yeah.
That nervous laughter of mine, that's the cringe I was feeling at the idea of getting back on LinkedIn. But by the time this conversation had happened, I'd already done the first round of old school email networking, and while that did yield tremendous results in that I received awesome contacts in the podcast industry, I was also very aware that LinkedIn, if anything, would be a great place to find additional intel on how podcast production companies hire or what it looks like to work in that field. Plus, the podcast show in London was coming up, and I knew that LinkedIn would be an ideal place to connect afterwards with whoever I would meet in person at the conference. And now, thanks to Mitch and Julia, I pictured myself connecting with podcast producers on the platform. So, albeit reluctantly, I created a profile. Even if the structure of a LinkedIn profile is pretty straightforward, you have an about section and then you just add your experience one position at a time, I felt a bit overwhelmed. There are two reasons for that. One, the dashboard has a lot of things to click on and sections to add to, which were incredibly distracting and felt like too many opportunities to quote unquote do it wrong. And two, I've had several professional lives. I've talked about them on episode 2, and even though they all make sense to me in the way that they've led me to decide at 40 years old to work in podcast production, I was worried that that might not come through on my profile. I was also afraid that the mention of the 3 podcasts I've created by myself these last 2 years might make me appear as a hobbyist, when in reality, what started out as passion projects 2 years ago greatly participated in making me the dedicated and skilled production professional that I've become. So I asked Mitch and Julia for guidance on how to curate my profile.
I would create a page for the podcast. So like it's basically like a company page. And I would put up the logo, and you can create as many companies as you want. So you could I would create one for each podcast actually. Yeah. The cool thing about creating a page for the podcast is then I would put under experience, I would put jobs like host or producer or whatever, and then put it at that podcast. And those would show up as experience as well. And each one would have a logo, which I think would be really cool. And then under each one, you add, it's like you can add media and you add a link. I would add a link to an episode. It just makes it look way more visual when people scroll through.
Yeah. Okay, good. I feel better now.
Actually, once you put in all those podcasts and all the experience that you have listed,
it's going to be very filled out.
Yeah. I mean, it won't even all show up on the first page. It'll have like a show more experience. So even if you just focus on the ones that are visible, it'll be a pretty stacked profile.
I'm so glad I followed that advice. I'm actually proud of my profile now. It does showcase my podcasting skills and also the kind of subjects that I've created episodes on. So hopefully it sort of gives anyone a clue on the kind of collaborator I would be within a production team. I'd love for you to check it out and tell me what you think. You can just type in Brune Smith and you'll find me. A big shout out to Mitch and Julia for their amazing help. So remember at the beginning of this episode, I told them I didn't want to post. But because I was going to go to the podcast show in London, which I'll mention in the very last episode of the series, because it was an amazing step in this adventure, I did want to connect with other producers on LinkedIn ahead of time, and I wanted to make it clear to anyone that I would be at the conference. So I ended up making a couple of posts, and one thing led to another. I started following a bunch of producers, but also podcast production companies, and while that is all good intel, before I knew it, I was spending too much time on the platform, pulling up the app at random times during the day, and feeling like I was back on social media. Because I was. And by doing all of that, I was no longer nurturing the wonderful relationships within the industry that I'd started creating by email, and I wasn't taking the time to actually apply to any jobs. So yeah, moving forward, I'm not going to post. I actually uninstalled the app, and I'll only use LinkedIn to connect with people occasionally, when it matters. All right, my friends, next week is the last episode, and I think it's going to be a surprising one. Stay tuned. Thank you for listening. Please send this episode right now to the friend it made you think of. This episode was produced and edited by me with help from Julia Mermelstein and Mitch Butler. Special thanks to Erin Rodgers and Andrew Herron. If you have your phone in your hand right now, you can do one of two things. One, pull up Apple Podcasts and leave a review of this podcast. This helps tremendously with discoverability. You can just write something simple, like one thing you like about this series. You can also do that on any other listening platform. Or two, if you'd like to say hi personally or professionally, even if it's 5 years from now, I'd love to hear from you. I mean that. You can email me at podcastingjob@gmail.com. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you next time.